Lately, I've noticed something interesting when talking with my friends. A lot of people my age are dating, but the moment the conversation turns to having kids, almost everyone falls silent for a few seconds and then said, "I'm not sure," or "probably not." And I've been trying to figure out what's actually behind that pause. I think something has fundamentally changed, and most people haven't really stopped to think about what it really is. If you ask someone from our parent generation, why did you have kids? They'd probably look at you like you'd lost your mind, because for them, it was never a question. You reached a certain age, you got married, you had children, that was pretty much the natural order of things. And honestly, in that world, that logic held up perfectly. But let's just go back 2 or 3 generations when China was still running on an agricultural economy. And in that system, a child was one of the best investments a family could make. One more kid meant one more pair's hand in the field. No tutoring belts, no school district apartment, no saving for 20 years just to afford their education. You added a bowl to the table, and by 6 or 7, that child was already contributing to the household. Low cost, clear return, short payback. Having 5 or 6 children was not a cultural habit, it was an economic decision that made complete sense. Now, think about what it looks like today. Raising one child in a major Chinese city from birth to university graduation costs, conservatively, millions of Chinese yuan. And it does not include the school district housing premium, the extracurriculars, or the possibility of studying abroad. So the equation has completely reversed. What used to be a relatively low-cost decision with a fairly visible return has become an enormously expensive one with no certain return at all. And I think that's where a lot of the disconnect between generations comes from. When older people ask, why wouldn't you just have a kid? Well, honestly, they're not being unreasonable. They're asking from a time when having children feel like the natural next step in life. Not a decision weighed down by this much financial pressure, time pressure, and uncertainty about the future. So what does the reality actually look like for young people right now? Start with the most basic thing, money. Most young people in big cities are spending a high percentage of their income just to keep their life running. Rent, food, transportation, the bare minimum. What's left after that is barely enough to take care of ourselves, let alone another human being. And of course, the usual answer is then work harder or more. But real life does not work that way. Because when you look at the people who are earning more, very often, what you see is a completely different trade-off. They leave home very early and come home late, weekends disappear into work, so maybe the money improves, but now you are facing a completely different question. Even if you can provide financially, do you actually have the time to be there? And this is where the real contradiction shows up. If your income is low, you cannot afford to raise a child. If your income is high, you don't have the time to be there for one. The middle ground, where you have both enough money and enough time, most ordinary people will never find it. And this is usually where someone's parents step in and said, "Don't worry, we'll help, we'll take off the baby." And in a lot of Chinese families, that is exactly what happens. But when you look at how this actually plays out, it creates a problem that nobody talks about at the start. The first one is the conflict. 2 generations with completely different ideas about how a child should be raised, living under the same roof, making decisions about the same kid. You want the child to learn independence. Your mother thinks you are being neglectful. You set boundaries around screen time. She lets him watch cartoons the moment you leave the room. These are not small disagreements. They come from fundamentally different worldviews, and they turn daily life into a constant negotiation that wears everyone down. And the second problem is deeper and harder to see. In child psychology, there is a concept called the primary attachment figure, which is the person a child bonds with most deeply in their early years. When both parents are working full-time and the grandparents becomes the primary caregiver, that deepest bond forms with grandma, not with mom or dad. And by the time your life becomes a little more stable, and you finally have more room to show up, you may realize something uncomfortable. The closeness you thought would come naturally just isn't there. The bond you and your child does not feel broken. It just does not feel as close as it should be. There is a kind of quiet politeness out there. Like the child knows you, trusts you, maybe even loves you, but does not quite come to you first. and that kind of distance can last much longer than people think. And the third thing is something people rarely say out loud, which is your parents have already done their job. They spent 30 years raising you. They are finally reaching a point where they can rest. And now, because of your decision, they are starting the entire process over again, at the age where their own health and energy are declining. If raising a child is exhausting at 25, it does not get easier at 60. So when people say, just let the grandparents handle it, it sounds like a solution, but in practice, it tends to create new problems while leaving the original ones unsolved. Now, let's set all the logistics aside for a moment. Assume the money works out, the time works out, the childcare somehow works out too. What kind of life is this child actually walking into? I've been questioning about this a lot lately because I've been through that system myself. And what stays with me the most is not just the pressure, it's how narrow the whole path becomes. Children are compared early, ranked early, and pushed into competition long before they're old enough to understand what that competition is doing to them. And by high school, for a lot of students, life shrinks into one thing: study, test, repeat. Page after page, paper after paper, mock exam after each mock exam. You keep doing problems, not because they can open up your mind, but because you need a slightly higher score than your last time. And after a while, that becomes your entire world. Not much room to explore what you're curious about, not much room to develop as a person, not much room to fail, reflect, try again, or grow in any way that isn't immediately measurable on paper. The message is actually quite simple. If it doesn't raise your score, it does not matter. And when you spend years living like that, something inside you starts to narrow too. Your attention narrows, your routine narrows, even your sense of self narrows. You begin to feel as if your value can be reduced to one number, one score, one ranking, one outcome. At the time, it all feels normal because everyone around you is living the same way. And maybe that is the most unsettling part. When a system applies the same pressure to everyone, it stops looking extreme, it starts to feel inevitable. But looking back now, I don't think it was inevitable at all, because I think asking teenagers to spend some of the most formative years of their lives in such a narrow cycle of drills, rankings, and constant comparison with almost no space to learn, grow, or become anyone outside the logic of exam comes as a real cost. And even if a child does everything that system asks of them, works hard, gets into university, graduates with a degree, the question still remains: what's waiting on the other side? A job market where the number of graduates far outweigh the number of positions. So after years of that kind of pressure, the long hours, the exhaustion, the sacrifice, you step out into the real world and realize the grind isn't over. It just changes shape. Now it's applications, interviews, rejections, more applications. And even when you do land a job, the early years of most careers demand just as much time and energy as school did. Except now you're also paying rent, feeding yourself, and trying to build a life from scratch. The hard part does not end after graduation, it just becomes a different kind of hard. And I think that continuity, the fact that there is no real finish line, is part of what makes people pause before putting a child through the same thing. So yeah, that is my take. I'm curious about yours. Do you think you'll want kids someday? And if not, what is the biggest reason? Or if you already have kids, does any of this land differently from the other side? I'd genuinely love to hear your perspective. So drop your comments down below in the comment section. And if you like my content, please feel free to like, share, or subscribe. It really helps and I really appreciate it. Okay, and I'll see you in my next one.